morning, members. Welcome to the first meeting of the Bills Committee on Employment and Retirement Schemes Legislation Offsetting Arrangement Amendments Bill 2022. Before we move on to the agenda proper, a kind reminder to members. In the meeting, please switch on your video function on Zoom and show the colored background. Keep the video function on and show your face. Members and other participants of the meeting should participate in this remote meeting in Hong Kong. Now, according to the arrangements of the president, for members returned from the EC, please use the orange background. For FC members, green background. For GC members, please use purple background. If there is no questions, then now the agenda proper. Item 1, election of chairman. Now we will proceed with the election of deputy chairman. Earlier on, the secretary has issued a notice that at the close of the nomination period concerning the nomination for deputy chairmanship, only one nomination was received. That is Mr. Tan Ka Biu, nominated by Mr. Wong Kwok, and seconded by Mr. Edward Leung. Now, according to the rules of procedures, if only one nomination is received for deputy chairmanship, then members can decide whether we need to elect deputy chairman. I consult members whether we need to proceed with the election of a deputy chairman. I see no hands so far. No objection. Now, in accordance with the relevant rules, if members consider it necessary to elect deputy chairman and only one nomination is received, then I will announce the relative nominee elected. Now, since I have consulted you, I announce Mr. Tan Ka Biu elected the deputy chairman of this Bills Committee. Congratulations, Mr. Tan Ka Biu. Now we have completed the election of deputy chairman. Now we move on to item 2, a meeting with the administration. Before we move on to the discussion, there are 2 housekeeping matters to be dealt with. Now, in the past, the Bills Committee would consult the members whether we need to invite the public to submit submissions concerning the bills. Since the epidemic situation is still very serious in Hong Kong, I propose uploading a notice on our website and invite written submissions from the public concerning the bills. The submissions received will be forwarded to members and the administration for a consolidated reply. So that has been our practice during the epidemic for Bills Committee. The members agree that we invite public submissions in this manner. Is that agreeable to all of you? Any objections? Chairman, Mr. Peter Siu. I understand that during the epidemic, we are using extraordinary means to deal with things, especially those related to the anti-epidemic measures. However, we are discussing about the abolition of the offsetting arrangements. This has a long and deep effect concerning our labor force and also our competitiveness. So This bill was only introduced a few days after the the Chinese New Year, and we only have a very short period to discuss it. According to the views, according to the business sector, they are in the dark about what the bill is about. If we only invite the administration to explain the bill with the documents, then it is not enough because it has a deep effect on the business sector. So maybe we should host a Zoom meeting to invite the stakeholders to voice the views rather than rushing it through in the remaining few months and in this term of the government. I don't support that. Thank you, Mr. Xu. Any other views concerning the matter? Mr. Tankabiu, the Deputy Chairman. Chairman, we respect Mr. Peter Xu's view. And of course, it is a complicated issue requiring a sophisticated manner to deal with it. I don't support his description that it has not been consulted. It has been on the table for many years, and it's received the bill received support across the political agenda. The bill has been amended, revised many times according to the views of different stakeholders. That's why we have the subsidy scheme. I don't agree Mr. Peter Xu's statement that the business sector was kept in the dark. We have revised the bill many times. That's why it took such a long time. This is the very important bill for this term of the Legislative Council. We want to involve the public. However, I hope the chairman can strike a balance, and we should not mistake expression with delay. Ms. Regina Ip, Chairman, to be fair, sorry, the speaker is not coming through. It seems that there is a transmission problem. Sorry, Mrs. Ip. The signal is not very stable. Am I coming through now? Yes. So please start again. Thank you, Chairman. Now about the abolition of the offsetting arrangements of MPF. Mrs. Carrie Lam, the Chief Executive, has spent a lot of time optimizing the bill. This is one of the three major priorities she mentioned in her election campaign. So it has been revised and optimized. Having listened to the business sector's views, subsidies would be given to micro and SMEs. There will be a designated account. Now with a front-loading approach, the government will inject funds into the designated accounts. Now the pre-transition periods portion would be offsetted. For the post-transition period, the government would subsidize it. So I think we should solve this issue as soon as possible. The benefits from MPF is very limited. If we allow the offsetting arrangements to remain, then it is a shame. Now, the government has promised that the business sector would be allowed to offset the LSP and SP, and also cap as 5%. So it is only reasonable for the government to subsidize the sector. The point is we have to know the amounts that the government has to subsidize. Is the money well spent? Well, it doesn't. We have to protect the welfare of employees as well as spare the SME the uncertainties. 25 years will pass in the blink of an eye. So we should be focused on asking questions on these matters. I do not object passage of the bill before the end of this term. We have to deal with this as soon as possible. Now, Mr. Danny Leung and Mr. Kingsley Wong. Thank you, Chair. Now, this bill is about the abolition of the offsetting arrangements of the MPF. This is a major policy of the government. It shows that the government cares for the public and care for the 3 million strong labor force. With the offsetting arrangements in place, many employees were deprived of MPF benefits as well as long service payments and severance payments. It really caused a dent on their retirement life. So it is a very important part of the government's livelihood policies. During her election campaign, Mrs. Carrie Lam pledged to resolve this issue within her term of office. So besides the long service payments and severance payments, we want to offer another layer of protection in employees' retirement life, so as to improve their retirement, the quality of their post-retirement life. In the past 2 decades, many sectors have a strong view concerning this arrangement. So we have come this far. It is likely that we can pass this bill in the remaining 6 months. The government has spent a lot of time and effort to work together with the business sector to optimize the bill. So I think we should do our best to implement the abolition and offer a better post-retirement life to employees. Of course, we should allow people to voice their views. But in the past 5 years, we are all aware that this is the trend. If you look at the documents of the LegCo, we would have a clear picture of the situation. So we should be focused and pass the bill. Our members, please first focus on whether we should invite the public's submission via written form or other manner. So please be focused. Concerning other views on the bill, well, feel free to voice them later on. Concerning soliciting public's views, now Mr. Kingsley Wong and then Mr. Lee Chen-Keung. Thank you, Chair. Like other members said, the bill concerning the abolition of the offsetting arrangements is carries huge importance. It has been on the table since the previous term of the government. So it is a long time coming, and we really need to, we have really revised the bill and optimized it. So the bottom line is we should pass this bill within the end of this legislative session. That should be the bottom line. That shows a respect to, we should respect the rights of the public to voice the view. However, we should also be a focus on expediting the passage of the bill within this legislative session. We are so close to we are so close, so we shouldn't defer the bill to the next term of the government, and then we will have to wait another 5 years. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Lee Chen-keung. Thank you. As a newcomer to the Legislative Council, I only learned of this bill. I know that the government has been discussing this in the last term, but I have not seen it in our papers. I only was made aware of more information this time when we received the papers. I agree with Mr. Xiu. It is actually a very big or major change for the small and medium enterprises, employers, and their employees. I hope that during the pandemic, we'll still be able to open this topic up for public discussion so that more organizations or deputations will have the opportunity to express their views so that they will have a better understanding of what the government is doing and how they're optimizing the scheme. Thank you. Well, I have to draw a line here. I see that there's still Mr. Benson, Mr. Rock Chen. And then after Mr. Rock Chen speaks, then we'll need to make a decision. Thank you, Chairman. I agree with what the other member said. We should conduct public consultations online during the pandemic. And I believe that we need to focus on the details on how we can optimize the scheme and to satisfy both sides of employers and employees. The business sector has concerns on how it could be optimized without compromising their rights. We do not want to drag it on too long. Therefore, the discussion should be very focused on certain parts of the bill or on certain clauses. Thank you. Well, I have heard all your views. First, some members would like to collect views online, and many other members want to ensure that we'll be able to pass the legislation in this term. I have heard these views. I have asked the Secretariat whether it is possible to conduct a public consultation online to see whether there are any technical difficulties. The Secretariat would need to iron out some technical details because when we hold public consultations online, we'll need to ensure that we're able to confirm their identities. I will discuss this further with the Secretariat after the meeting to see whether this is feasible. We didn't have much experience in holding a bills committee online, so I think I would first discuss with the Secretariat afterwards to see whether we could bring this forward. Well, we need to ensure that we'll be able to confirm the identities of the organizations. So please allow me to discuss this further later on. Let's move on to the next housekeeping item. Today, before the meeting, we received actually a letter from the Innovation and Technology Joint Association. So we have already sent this out to all members. So please take note of that paper. And now let us move on to the proper agenda of the day, which is to meet with the administration. First of all, I would like to introduce you to members of the administration, including Mr. Chris Soon, Commissioner for Labor, Ms. Chung Hoi Shan, Assistant Commissioner for Labor, Ms. Catherine Law, Chief Labor Officer, Offsetting Policy of Labor Department, Ms. Cecilia Chen Poi Cheng, Senior Labor Officer of Labor Department, and Mr. Manuel Ng, Senior Assistant Law Draftsman of Department of Justice, and Ms. Wendy Ho, Government Counsel of Department of Justice. Welcome to this meeting. Well, let me run you through what our discussion should be focused on. First, to amend Employment Ordinance Cap 57 and on other ordinances in relation to employment, and also on the mandatory provident fund schemes ordinance and some of the parts of the occupational retirement schemes ordinance and grant schools provident fund, and that we will not be able to continue to use it to offset the severance payments and long service payments, and to set up the transitional arrangements, and also to make legislative amendments and miscellaneous amendments. You could refer to the papers uploaded on the website. The legal advisor on 28th of February had sent a letter to the administration with questions on particular issues. And this is LC paper number CB bracket 128/2022/02. The administration has also sent a reply, which is CB bracket 2139/2022/01. At this time, let me go through with the arrangements of the day. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand on the Zoom function. And in order to be fair, I would instruct staff members to first delete all the raise hand indicators before asking you to raise your hand on Zoom again. And then I would invite members to take turns to speak. As this is a remote meeting, when your time is almost up, staff will show you a timer on how much time you have left to speak, and you would hear a beep when your time is up. At this time, I'll ask our staff to first delete all the raised hand indicators. And before you ask questions, I'd like to first invite the commissioner to take us through the bill, and then we will open the floor for members' questions. Commissioner. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members. I would briefly share with you the content of the bill. But before I do that, I hope members understand that the background is also very important. We're talking about the offsetting arrangement. While we continue to hope you understand that this has gone through 2 terms of government. We have made a comprehensive consultation with employers and employees on different occasions. We have discussed with chambers of commerce and have also held breakfast meetings with smaller enterprises. What you see in front of you has gone through many changes and amendments, and we believe that this is the best balance struck. So this is the premise of the bill. We basically involve 5 ordinances, 3 of which are subsidiary legislation. And the one most important is the employment ordinance. The second, the mandatory provident fund scheme ordinance. And then also the occupational retirement schemes ordinance. And then we will need to look into protection of wages in insolvency ordinance and inland revenue ordinance, in which details are needed. So this is basically the structure of the arrangement. Well, there are two main principles for this offsetting arrangement. At this moment, on how we calculate the severance pay and the long service payment, and the maximum or the cap remains the same. So what do I mean by that? The current rate for calculating severance pay and LSP is, for each year of service, you will be able to receive 2/3 of the last monthly wages. Let's say you've worked for 6 years, so you'll be able to receive 4 months of 2/3 of your monthly wage in the last month. But there's actually a maximum payment that the first cap is 22,500. And then there would also be a maximum payment of 390,000. So this remains the same, and this is exactly how we calculate the current rate. Secondly, when you read the legislation, there are 3 things that you could offset: your severance pay, your long service pay. So if you receive gratuities based on length of service, then you could still be able to offset it in the future. Secondly, under the MPFS, employers could contribute more for the employee. So this is the voluntary contributions. So if employers are paying voluntary contributions, then they could still be offset. So the one part that could not be offset is the 5% of the MPF. Well, it seems that I'm talking about a lot of figures, but that is actually the second main principle. This time, for the arrangement, we are actually very forward-looking. There would not be any retrospective arrangements. So all the SP or LSP before the effective date could still be offsetted as with previous arrangements. But what you cannot offset is after the day comes, or after the legislation comes into effect. So you will be able to calculate, and there would also be time for the employers to gradually adjust to the change. We do need a supporting subsidies. So why would you need grants or subsidies? We would like to help the micro and small enterprises to remain stable during the transitional period. Well, but this is not mentioned under the bill. It is after the bill is passed that we would ask the FC to give us 33.2 billion to do. And then on the designated savings account scheme is the second support. And the third one is when we need to implement the scheme, we will be able to use the EMPF platform, which is already under development, to implement the scheme properly. So under this structure, there are some details I would like to share with you. First of all is when it would come into effect. So there's actually a transition date. So once we set the transition date, from that day on, you will not be enough. You will not be able to offset the SP and LSP. And I also have to explain some complicated issues. So when the employee starts his job, but then he works past the transition date, and therefore we would need to handle this in a technical manner.
So how does that work? Under the bill, the SP and the LSP will be separated into two parts. We will draw a line on the transition date. The portion before that would be called the pre-transition portion, and the part falling after the transition date would be called the post-transition portion. For the post-transition part, it is easy. We can no longer use the monetary contribution of the employer to offset it. The pre-transition portion can still be offset, but there will be technical revision. In calculation of the LSP and SP, I said that we use the last month's wage to calculate it. If it falls on the transition days, then it is more complicated. So for the pre-transition portion, we will not take your last month's wage for a base. We will use your wage on the transition date. Now, our target is having the transition date in year 2025. So we will take your last month wage falling on the transition date to calculate the pre-transition portion of your LSP and SP. The purpose is to allow the employer to have a clear idea how much will the pre-transition portion of the LSP and SP be. This will provide certainty for the employer and avoid behavior out of uncertainties. And also, the maximum amount of the LSP or the SP shall be capped at $390,000. Now, for the part exceeding that part, where will it be deducted from the pre-transition part or the post-transition part? Now, according to the bill, if your LSP or SP exceeds $390,000, then it will be deducted from the post-transition part. Let's say if your accumulated amount of LSP is at $200,000, and then you get a $200,000 more after the transition, then altogether there will be $400,000. So $10,000 in excess. So now the pre-transition portion will be $200,000, and then the post-transition part will become $190,000. This is a very important technical amendments. The point is to avoid a massive dismissal when the transition happens. It would be beneficial for the employer to retain the employer after the transition date, because you are still able to offset the pre-transition portion of the LSP and SP, but not the post-transition part. For the part exceeding $390,000, and they would be deducted from the post-transition part. So if you dismiss all the employers and get a new batch of employers, then all the new employees will be entitled to the new arrangements. The entire sum of the LSP and SP will be calculated based on the post and transition arrangement. So that's our thinking. This is a compromise reached after massive discussion, and this is a cautious and prudent way to go. Now, I know that the labor sector is very worried. For if you are using the wage on the transition date rather than the last month's wage, then for some special circumstances, the employees may be worse off. For example, before the transition date, my wage was $15,000. After the transition date, the employer raised my wage massively. Or there is a very long period of employment before the transition, and then the post-transition employment period is short. Then for these scenarios, the employees may be worse off after the abolition of the plan. So the bill provides that the government would make up for the shortfall, and the employees will not be worse off. So we have been talking about MPF. In effect, many employees are employed under the occupational retirement schemes or grant schools provident fund, and a very small portion of employees, they are entitled to overseas provident fund. They are making no contribution to Hong Kong's MPF. So this bill would apply to all of them. So for these provident fund schemes, there is no distinction between the voluntary and mandatory part. So we would make reference to a formula under the MPF to calculate the benefits. So it is specified in the bill, there will be a portion of non-offsettable benefits, which is equivalent to the employer's mandatory contribution under MPF. That will be non-offsettable. For the remaining parts, that will be equivalent to the voluntary benefits. So it is like a mirror. We are just copying the MPF systems arrangements to those entitled to occupational retirement schemes, and also grant schools, provident fund, and overseas employees. And there are two technical arrangements, or technical amendments. First, the Inland Revenue Ordinance would be amended to specify that SP and SP under the new arrangements would not be chargeable under the salaries tax. And also the protection of wages on insolvency ordinance. That is also a technical arrangement. We have a subrogation arrangement. If the employer refused to pay, then the PWIB, the protection of wages on insolvency board, will pay first. And then the PWIB would PWIF, or rather the PWIF board would recover the amount of ex gratia payments from the employer. Now, in the future, the mandatory contribution of the employer would not be offsettable. So we would make a technical amendment to specify that the board will not be entitled to recover the ex gratia payments from the sum. If there is a wage deduction within 10 months prior to the transition date, prior to termination, then the arrangement would be applicable. If the 12 months span across the transition dates, then the employees will also be benefited. So that's the amendments on the PWI ordinance. So there are lots of amendments. We want to specify the arrangements for each scenario. Now we need a supporting scheme from the government, that is the subsidy scheme. So we have revised the subsidy scheme many times. In the past 5 to 7 years, the original idea was a subsidy of $7.9 billion only. And then it was increased to $17 billion. Now the amount has increased to $33.2 billion, calculated at the 2021 level. So for the first 9 years, if you are a SME, definition being that the LSP and SP payments are not exceeding $500,000 for that year, then for each employee, the government would pay for you. For the first 3 years, for each employee, with a sum not exceeding $500,000, the employer only needs to pay $3,000 each. The remaining sum would be paid for by the government. So that will provide certainty. Now, why the government is so confident in the scheme for the first 3 years, like I said, it is not a retrospective arrangement. So for the first year after the transition, the non-offsettable amount will only be 1 year. So if you take it to the highest, the maximum amount will be $55,000. The second year would be double that, and the third year triple that. So the design is during the initial periods, more subsidy would be given to SMEs so that they can adapt to the new arrangements. Now, lastly, the designated saving accounts, that is not subsidized by the government. It is rather a legal tool to mandate employers to save up money to pay OSP and SP. So I will pause here, Chairman. I will take members' questions and we will do our best to explain the bill. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. So this is the first meeting. That's why I had to allow the Commissioner more time to explain the provisions of the bill to the public and members. Now, members, before I invite you to raise your hands, I will invite the staff to clear all the raised hand marks. Now, please raise your hands. Now, let me count the hands and estimate the speaking time. So far, 8 members have raised their hands. Now, I will allow 4 minutes each, including questions and answers. First, Mr. Stanley Ng, and then Mr. Rock Chen. Mr. Stanley Ng, please. 4 minutes each. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Chair. The abolition of the offsetting arrangements, like other members said, it has gone through 2 terms of the governments. Now, like the Commissioner said, the provisions under the bill have been vastly discussed. And it is a consensus to protect labor's benefits, and it is also the trend. So it has been really discussed thoroughly. The point is we have to legislate as soon as possible to consolidate the fruit of our discussion. So this is something that we have to do as soon as possible. And the government is willing to make up for the shortfall with the public fund to protect employees' benefits, to make sure that they are not worse off than the current arrangements. I think this is a very suitable arrangement. Now, my concern is, when will the abolition be implemented? How we can make sure that employees are benefited as soon as possible. Now, according to the current timetable, subject to the passage of the bill, it will not be until 2025 when employees will get the benefits. The reason being that we have to wait for the completion of the eMPF platform. Well, I don't think that is acceptable. First, the eMPF platform has taken a really long time to come into full operation. And also, why do we have to bind the eMPF platform with the offsetting arrangements? Obviously, it is to accommodate executive arrangements without considering the long wait of 3 years on the employees' part. Some workers will retire soon simply because of the lack of a fully operating eMPF platform. They will be deprived of their employees' benefits. This is not fair. How will the government make up for them? Chairman, I fully support the abolition of the offsetting arrangements. I welcome it. I think we should legislate as soon as possible. Also, the plan should be implemented sooner. And I also want the administration to respond to my question. Why do we have to bind the effective date of the bill with the eMPF platform? That is totally unfair to employees. Thank you.
Director. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. for your question. I hope you all understand. abolishing the offsetting arrangement and supporting measures is a very complicated plan. To do this properly, you need a very developed and mature e-platform, and the EMPF platform can help us with that. And Mr. Tang Ka-biu and I are both on the board of the EMPF. And we're working together with the MPF to complete the platform by 2025. And with this platform, we'll be able to effectively cut cost and implement the abolition. Well, members, please allow time for the administration to answer questions. Let me read out the order of speaking. There are 9 other members who would like to speak. Mr. Rock Chen, Mr. Jimmy Ng, Mr. Kennedy Wong, Mr. Xiu Ka-fei, Mr. Zhao Xiu Chong, Mr. Tang Ka-biu, Mr. Dennis Leung, and Mr. Holden Chow. Mr. Rock Chen, thank you. Well, after consultation for many years between 3 parties, it's finally now being brought up to LegCo. Our party supports this bill, but I have consulted some chambers of commerce and they still have some concerns. First of all, the spirit of the bill is not actually in line with the pledge by the administration in the initial stage. Of course, we all understand that the government needs to move with the times. The business sector believes that they need more time to absorb all this information, especially for the small and medium enterprises. They're not very familiar with it and are not clear the operation of the designated savings account scheme. And so first of all, the government must step up efforts to explain the operations of this legislation. And many enterprises believe that this will be a huge impact on their operation costs. Due to the pandemic, enterprises encounter high risk in their operations. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know when the pandemic will be over, but then this will really bring operational pressure to SMEs. The government should provide extra help such as subsidies or low interest loans or interest-free loans to support SMEs. The government should also allow more flexibility to adjust the 33.2 billion subsidy and scheme, and perhaps to actually provide a bit more scheme. Some people have also reflected their views that they're afraid that some employers would use different excuses to dismiss employees or to sign new contracts to recalculate their long service payments. Some from the labor sector also expressed a concern that some employers may try to find ways to evade from paying these LSP. So I do hope that the director will be able to address my concerns. Thank you, Chairman. I agree with Mr. Chen. We're going to do our best to step up our campaign and also to reach out to different sectors. We have already done a lot and have heard views from many different sectors. They have also relayed their concerns as well. Mr. Chen asked about the 33.2 billion subsidy scheme. This is actually a figure from our calculations. We believe that in money of day terms in 2021, it's actually 33.2 billion. But then after the passage of the bill, we would also apply to the Finance Committee for funds and will adjust it when necessary. As this is a 25-year subsidy scheme, after it has been in operation for 5 years, we're going to conduct a review and then report back to the LegCo on whether we would need to make minor adjustments. Thirdly, would some employers try to shirk their responsibilities? I think that we have done quite well in the past. We face new challenges in the future, but then those challenges are not anything new. Severance pay came out in 1970s and long service payment was introduced in the 1980s. At that time, we did not have the MPF scheme, which means that in the 80s or in the 90s, people also faced the same issue that the employers need to pay SP and LSP. We understand that with the passage of the bill, we would step up our services for both employers and employees. I'm not saying that there are many disputes between employers and employees, but then you have to understand whether the employees were dismissed illegitimately. Therefore, we understand that we'll need to also enhance manpower to handle those issues, but I believe we'll be able to deal with it very well. Mr. Jeremy Ng and then Mr. Kennedy Wong. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask about the subsidy scheme. In 2019, you based it on the 2019 figures to introduce this 25-year subsidy scheme, but the economy has been going downward. In 2020, 5.7 billion, and in 2020 it's about 5.4 billion in the offsetting arrangement. But now with the new legislation coming into place, you're still using figures from 2019, so it's not actually quite appropriate. Would you actually try to reflect it using money of the day prices instead? Commissioner. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ng. You could refer to the figures from the MPFA in 2020 and 2021. You can see that the maximum amount has increased, but that is because of a higher number of employers and employees. There is as I said, there is a cap that the monthly wage can only reach up to 22,500 and the maximum payment is 390,000. So in 2018, 2019, and 2020, each employee would receive around 90,000 and each employer would need to pay out about 300,000. But it's because there is a higher number of employers and employees, therefore you would see a higher figure. And actually you can see that if we draw a line, we are talking about 90%, covering 90% of the employees. I'm sorry, who is speaking through the mic? I'm sorry, please continue. Yes, I also heard some noises in the background. So if we draw the line at 500,000, so we are covering about 90% of micro and small enterprises severance pay needs. So even if there is a higher headcount, the 500,000 will be enough to cater for 90% of the employees and employers. Thank you. Next, Mr. Kennedy Wong, and then Mr. Shiokapai will follow. Thank you, Chairman. Well, I've heard members speak and I agree with what the business sector said. I have to state the position of our sector. The Chinese General of Chamber of Commerce have sent out our views to the government. We understand where the government is coming from with this amendment to better protect employees' rights. At the same time, we hope the government will understand that creation of jobs basically come from 98% of these micro and small medium-sized enterprises. In the last 2 years of pandemic, many of these small enterprises have been encountering difficulties and pressures. We are still fighting the pandemic, but the government introducing this at this time is sort of inappropriate because it would add more pressure to the MSMEs. Therefore, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce would like to suggest to the administration to delay the discussion to a later date after the pandemic, or even to delay the passage of the bill. In the long run, Hong Kong should provide more benefits to employees, but you should not only just look at certain responsibilities. We believe that the government should come up with a scheme to support workers, and then we should have the workers take out 1% of their wages every month to put it in a fund for future use. And we have previously suggested that this scheme could help us resolve issues between employers and employees. The pandemic is still very severe. Therefore, more consultation should be done to ensure that a scheme could be accepted by both sides. We see the mainland adopting a community-wide supporting scheme, and then currently there are around 200 to 300 million mobile population on the mainland who have not really signed long-term contracts, and many times the employers only pay out to the employees privately. Therefore, they did not need to pay out certain contributions. I hope that we could also draw reference from this so that there will be more protection for the employees. Commissioner, thank you. Abolition of the offsetting arrangement is important to the future protection of employees, and the discussion has gone on for over 2 terms of government. We understand that at this moment there are concerns, but the passage of the bill does not mean immediate effect of the bill. The earliest date would be 2025. However, if we do not pass the bill today, then we will not be able to start the work that would lead us into our work. Thank you.
Mr. Peter Xiu, and then Mr. Zhao Xiuchong. Thank you. Now, Mrs. Regina Ip just said the government floated the idea of abolishing the offsetting arrangements. I mean, the MPF contribution scheme. The government pledged to the business sector that when businesses fold up, the government can pay in advance for the business sector. That's why the plan received support from the business sector. Is that true, Commissioner? Is that the pledge? Chairman, thank Mr. Peter Xiu for his question. Now, the design of the law is that the employer will be allowed to offset the LSP and SP with the mandatory contribution of the employer. It's reflected the consensus between the government, business sector, and the employees. It would be an agreeable plan to all. The law is clear about that. Please understand that laws would change in time. Employees, especially low-wage grassroots employees, if they're only relying on their mandatory 5% contribution, it is not enough to offer protection to their retirement. With the aging population in Hong Kong, we have to strengthen the MPF pillar in terms of retirement protection. We can do that by combining the 5% employers' contribution with the 5% employees' contribution. It would be equivalent to 10%, and it would mean much better protection. However, it requires a lot of work to achieve that. That's why 2 terms of government have spent a lot of effort to enhance the protection. So like Mr. Peter Xiu said, that's why we have to propose the idea of abolishing the offsetting plan, and that's why we have to spend a lot of time to improve it. In short, the government made a promise, and then the sum didn't add up. So the government is making the business sector to pay more. Now, retirement protection should involve all, and I think no one would oppose to the idea of a better retirement protection but should the burden be entirely put on the business sector, and what will the impacts be on our competitiveness? We have to study the impact. Now, under the current arrangements, there are 5% from the employee and the employer 10%, and you think this is not enough. Now, with this new plan, means that the employer will have to pay an extra 5% in the long run. So it seems that the government, the employer, only needs to pay 1%, and there will be a designated account and the subsidy. But in 5 years' time, if the 1% contribution does not cover all, then the government will pay 50% of the contribution. After 5 years, the other 50% will also be borne by the employers. Now, my friends are totally clueless. They think the perception is they only have to pay 3% in the first 3 years. Now, the employer's contribution is some $30 billion. Now, in 25 years' time, it will be equivalent to $800 billion. This sum will be borne by the business sector. So how much will the government pay in these 25 years? How are you going to help the business sector? Brief reply, please. Thank you, Mr. Peter Xiu. Now, we can look at it this way. Every year, the employer's mandatory contribution, like Mr. Peter Xiu said, will be some $30 billion. Other members also mentioned that the amount being offset for every year is some $5 to $6 billion each year. So every year, employers are paying some $30 billion. However, not the entire sum is being offset. Only a portion of it is offset. It is some $5 billion annually. So does it mean that the government, that the employers have to bear the $800 billion sum? Well, that's not true. Judging by the latest figure, it is just $5 to $6 billion each year. We cannot multiply we cannot base the calculation on $30 billion each year. And also, there is a sufficiently long period of transition, especially for the first 5 to 10 years when employers are still adapting. The government will pay an additional $33.2 billion to provide more support in favor of the employers. However, in the long run, LSP and SP should be borne by the employers. Thank you. Mr. Siu, should I wait for the next turn? Thank you. Mr. Chow Siu Chung and then Mr. Bill Tang. Thank you, Chair. Now, the abolition of the offsetting arrangements has been discussed in 2 terms of the government. Now, the consensus on principle is achieved towards the end of the last term of the government. At the time, the initial plan was floated by the last term of the government. Now, the bill is introduced only now. It's because of the consultation by the government with the business sector and other stakeholders in order to help the micro and SMEs to transition. So I think the government should do its best to legislate for this plan. So I think members of the Bills Committee and the administration should work double time to pass the bill before the end of this legislative session. And I'm also concerned about the implementation timetables subject to the passage of the bill. It is perplexing to us why we have to bind the implementation of the scheme with the EMPF platform. So what if we encounter hiccups? If it is not fully operating in a few years' time, what will be the contingency plans? For example, will there be a simpler system to keep track of the LSP and SP of the transition date and when the EMPF platform is fully in operation, the record can be transferred. And there should also be a contingency plan in case the platform is not up and running. So the government should think hard on that and give us a plan B. And for special circumstances, employees may be worse off after the transition. So like the commissioner said, the government pledges to make up for the shortfall with administrative measures. Well, I don't quite follow it. If it is not written black and white in the legislation, how can we hold the government to account? Commissioner. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Chow Siu Chung, for your questions. Now, the preparation of the EMPF platform is in full steam. We are all striving to fully implement the platform and the scheme by year 2025. Well, Mr. Chow Siu Chung's question was a hypothetical one. If we encounter unforeseen obstacles in setting up the platform and there is a major delay, what will be the contingency plan? Well, the Labor Department has thought hard on it. If that occurs, there will be a backup plan. In the unfortunate event that in year 2025, because of various reasons, there is a major delay for the implementation of the platform, then like Mr. Charles Chung said, we will have plans to implement the abolition of the offsetting plan before year 2025 anyway. So we want to set an exact date for the stakeholders. So the target is 2025. Of course, it would be best if we have the eMPF platform. It will incur lower administrative costs, and it is very convenient. In any event, we will have a plan B to make sure that the abolition is will go ahead before 2025. So that's the first question. And second, how you can be sure that we will fulfill a promise? Well, that is a solemn promise. We estimate that only a very small number of employees will need the government to subsidize the shortfall. Now, our colleagues will reach out to employers and employees. If employees are worse off after the transition, we will make up for the shortfall. It is more convenient than having it written in the bill. The bill is so complicated as it is. It is not worth making it more complicated. And also, this is only a small issue which can be addressed through administrative measure. Thank you. Then Mr. Bill Tang, and then Mr. Dennis Leung. Thank you, Chair. To me, this bill is a dream come true. It is something that I have been personally involved in since the 2016 legislative term. I was representing the labor sector, and then I was on the labor advisory board, or you can call it negotiation or discussion. Anyway, a plan agreeable to employers and employees was formulated. Of course, it is not a perfect plan for either the employers and the employees. Because of our aging population and the flaws in our system, it is a good step ahead. As some members correctly pointed out, in the mainland, because of the aging population and the change of the economic economy, some employees are not employed under a formal employer-employee relationship. So of course, with a better employment system in Hong Kong and with the eMPF platforms, I think this is something that even the mainland can learn from us. In the mainland, there is a social security system with a tripartite contribution with a pledge made by the government. However, it may not be applicable to all forms of employer-employee relationship. So subject to the passage of the bill, I can proudly say that MPF is a very good system in Hong Kong. And the flaws are no more. So let's work together to create a good retirement protection scheme in Hong Kong. And some said that the burden on employers would be heavier. Of course, that is a consideration. However, I think there is a subsidy scheme which has been revised thrice. I think it will be sufficient to help the employers to deal with the heavier commitments. In the past, when there was the offsetting arrangements, employees would LSP or SP would be distributed casually. So now with the change in plan, I don't think that will happen again.
Frankly speaking, many people like to compare Hong Kong with Singapore. In Singapore, the employer needs to pay 20% of the employee's wages in the MPF. In Australia, it's at least 9%. So if we are only talking about 5% contributions now, the employers really do not need to pay much for the employees. Abolishing the offsetting arrangement does not necessarily mean overdoing it. And it wouldn't affect Hong Kong's competitiveness. In Singapore, employers need to contribute 20% of the employee's wages. So it's really much less in Hong Kong. We must make this clear. I hope that the administration can also tell us what the impact on the employers if they dismiss their employees early. Director, can you just kindly address the last point? Yes, thank you. In our design, employers do not get anything out of early dismissal of employees because they could still offset all the SP and LSP. So actually, if you let the employees work past the transition date, then you would only need to calculate because you would look into the amount of pre-transition portion of the SP or LSP with the post-transition date, and therefore there is of course no benefit to the employer to dismiss the employee early. Mr. Dennis Leung. Thank you. As a representative of the labor sector, I hope I can speak up for the 300,000 workers in Hong Kong. Since the setting up of the MPF, it has actually compromised the rights and benefits of employees. Some enterprises have been providing benefits for the employees after protection, but with the introduction of the MPF in the year 2000, the government added in the offsetting arrangement benefiting the employers, yet affecting the 300,000 odd workers in Hong Kong. Employees only want to enjoy a good life after retiring. However, with the offsetting arrangement, that is not the case. In the past few years, the government has been working with the business sector to optimize the scheme. The current scheme actually is a good solution for MSMEs. Therefore, I hope LegCo will put their focus in helping employees. Can the administration ensure the eMPF platform be launched by the end of 2024 so that all trustees could transition before 2025 for the smooth operation of the DSA scheme? And can you also set a date to allow employees understand that 2025 would see the abolition of the offsetting arrangement and not have it move till the end of 2025, because that would be another year's wait? Commissioner, thank you. The eMPF platform is not the responsibility of our department, although Mr. Tankabil and I also work on that. We understand that all parties involved are doing their best to fully launch the eMPF platform by 2025. It'll be too difficult to have it introduced in 2025. We should just follow the current timeline to launch it in about April or May of 2025. So this goes back to how I answered Mr. Chow Siu Chong. We do have a contingency plan. Even if the eMPF platform is delayed, we would use an indirect way to ensure that by 2025, we'll be able to fully abolish the offsetting arrangement and to have it implemented. Let me read out the names. For those who like to speak for the first time, we have Mr. Lee Chen Kung, Mr. Holden Chow, Dr. Wong Yushan, Ms. Doreen Kong, and Mr. Kingsley Wong. And for second round, Mr. Xiu Ka Fai. Let me first invite Mr. Lee Chen Kung, followed by Mr. Holden Chow. Commissioner, I have a simple economic question. Many MSMEs have complained that now they will need to use high wages to hire employees. So employees will need to contribute to the MPF scheme, and that is a huge operational cost. So when the offsetting arrangement is abolished, can you estimate the increase in cost on employers? And would that cost increase be transferred to consumers and thus spike up inflation? Thank you, Mr. Lee, for your question. Under the employment ordinance, not all employees would receive severance payments or long service payments. We're talking about continuous employment for 2 years, and the employee must be dismissed before you get severance pay. And for long service payment, you have to work for continuous 5 years. So not everyone would receive SP or LSP. Contract work does not involve any SP or LSP. I can share with you another view. An employer who has worked for 5 years would receive LSP and at the same time maybe gratuity. And more employees would then be willing to work for a longer period of time. And that would be beneficial to a longer and more stable employer-employee relationship. On cost increase of the arrangement, we believe that there would not be a huge impact on employers. Currently, we're talking about 600 billion in wage payout. But in the figures from the MPFA, offsetting only accounts for about 5 billion. We have tried to work this out with the government economists, and we believe that there will not be too much of an impact on operations, perhaps a bit, but it should be tolerable, and there will not be too much of an financial implication. Well, for MSMEs, especially the catering business, they pay about 10,000 to 20,000 wages to the employees. And if they need to earmark SP and LSP, then maybe that burden will be transferred to the customers. Have you looked into the cost increase for each sector, or could you share with us such figures? Thank you, Chairman. It's very hard for us to give you a breakdown. Employers' expenses include rent, overhead, and therefore we cannot only look at the employees' wages, but we have carried out a thorough discussion with economists, and we believe that there will not be too much of a financial impact. So how much are you talking about? Chairman, the employers do not only pay severance pay and wages. Some of them spend a majority of the expenses on rent, some on overhead. And so it's very hard for us to have a detailed breakdown. But the offsetting amount each year compared to the overall wage payout is not very huge. Therefore, there should not be a huge financial implication. Well, you can ask a second round later on. Next, Mr. Holden Chow, and then Dr. Wong Yun Shan. Thank you. Chairman, can you hear me? Yes, thank you. On the abolition of the offsetting arrangement, the DAB has also asked for views from the SMEs. We do have some questions for the Commissioner. First, on the timeline. Today, you said that it would be implemented in 2025. We understand that a timeline is needed, but the pandemic is still very severe. The SMEs are already under huge financial pressure. Have you considered, when you set the date to be 2025, that we would see such a epidemic? Can you hear me? Well, it's better now. We didn't really hear your question just now. I apologize. Let me ask my question again briefly. I just want to ask the administration. First of all, to fully implement this in 2025, have you considered that with the severity in pandemic, many SMEs are hugely impacted? And if the pandemic continues, would you actually delay the implementation date? Secondly, I see in paragraph 22 of the paper that there would be the introduction of a designated savings account scheme under which the employers will be mandated to save up for meeting their future SP or LSP liabilities after the abolition. Can you provide us with more information on the scheme, on how to save up? SMEs find it difficult enough during the pandemic. So what are the details of the DSA scheme? Because I see that you're also going to bring up another legislation.
Commissioner, can you hear the question? Yes, I can. Now, the target of year 2025, that's in consideration of the completion date of the eMPF platform. There are still 3 years to go. We think 3 years time is sufficient for preparation and adaptation. We don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what will happen in year 2025. But given the 3 years time, it is sufficiently long for preparation and adaptation. And Mr. Chow mentioned the Designated Savings Accounts Scheme, or DSA scheme. That's a supporting measure. Subject to the passage of the bill, when the statutory obligations are clearly defined, then we will offer this as a supporting measure. Like Mr. Holden Chow said, the DSA scheme is a safeguard. We want to ensure sufficient available funds. So what we are doing now concerning the bill is the primary step. The DSA scheme is a supporting measure. For the details of the DSA scheme, we will discuss it with council members on how we can better implement the scheme and offer more support to SMEs which are already struggling. We don't have to discuss the details of the scheme right now. The details are adjustable. So the point is we have to decide whether we will proceed with the abolition of the offsetting arrangement. After the passage of the bill, we have sufficient time to talk about the detailed implementation of the DSA scheme. Thank you. Dr. Wong Yunshan and then Ms. Doreen Kong. We can't hear you yet. Just a moment. Dr. Wong Yunshan. Am I coming through? Yes, we can hear you. Please begin. My apologies. Commissioner? I would like to follow up on the question of the transition date, which is packed with the eMPF platform as well as the DSA scheme. You said the DSA scheme is a supporting measure for employers to manage their cash flow, to make sure that they would save up to meet the cash flow demand. So that is the employer's money. So I'm curious, for the eMPF platform, it is quite complicated, not just technically, but there are lots of contesting views among stakeholders. So the timetable is still unsure, like you said. There is a timetable, but we don't know how likely we are to achieve that. So I would like to hear more about the backup plan you mentioned. Now, even without the DSA scheme, cash flow management is the instinct of businesses. Even without the DSA scheme, businesses would engage cash flow management on their own. So I am curious why you are packing the cash flow situation with the transition date, especially when you said that the DSA scheme is not the primary concern. This is a supporting measure to help employers to engage in cash flow management. So I wonder why you are packing it with the transition date. even in the absence of the DSA scheme, they know how to manage the cash flow, and we are just talking about a few years. The contribution the difference in terms of contribution is not that much. So why are we pegging the DSA scheme and the AMPF platform with the transition date? So my last question is about whether there are other technical concerns. That's why you are setting the transition date in year 2025. Commissioner. Thank you, Dr. Wong. Your observation is correct. Yes, the DSA is a tool for managing cash flow. Through legislative means, we require employers to make mandatory contribution to the account. So in terms of administrative costs and so on, it would be much easier and much more convenient by using the EMPF platform. That's why we are setting up this platform. So it is similar to the monthly contribution under the MPF scheme. You are saving up monthly to meet the LSP and SP in future. To make sure that the abolition of the offsetting arrangements works, besides the legislative means, we have to have supporting measures. First, the subsidy scheme, and then the DSA scheme. The most ideal situation is to have both supports available. So the design is to have the supporting measures available in year 2025 together with the transition. So besides the DSA scheme, the EMPF platform also helps. On the transition date, we would take a snapshot of the record. We require employers to maintain a 12-month record. However, some employers might have lost the record. So we have to take a snapshot on the transition days. And then we will have a snapshot picture of the employment situation on the transition date. So that will surely help. So the whole idea of the EMPF platform is to offer two pillars of support besides the legislation. With the two supporting wheels, the abolition will work better. Ms. Doreen Kong and then Mr. Kingsley Wong. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Commissioner. I support abolishing the offsetting arrangements. That is a basic or fundamental protection for employees. I have two concerns. Now, about the EMPF platform, when we hear the word platform, it seems that we would be spooked off because we don't have faith. Now, Commissioner, you said the preparation is in full steam. Now, to avoid doubts among members and the public, maybe the Commissioner can tell us in more accurate terms what is the progress and what are the bottlenecks in designing the platform. Now, the bill has been discussed for a long time. It shouldn't be difficult to achieve if we are united. Now, for some ordinances, some bills, implementation is difficult despite the passage of the bill. For example, the adverse possession bill, it hasn't been implemented 20 years after the passage of the bill. So I am concerned about the operational difficulties. So like Dr. Wong said, is it really necessary to set a timetable that far away? And can we draw a line so that the difficulties in setting up the platform would not drag the whole system with it? Now, about the support for micro and SMEs, I've read the provisions on the bill. The mechanism and the provisions are very complicated with a wide scope. Since it is so far-reaching, how do you plan to explain it to the public? Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rincon, for your questions. Now, about the progress of the eMPF platform, the Labor Department is not the leading department in this. I will convey your questions to the relevant departments. They will be in a better position to give you an update. However, I am also involved in the review of the design of the platform. So we are making every moment count to prepare for it. And the second question is very valid. I know there are worries. Will the implementation of the abolition plan be delayed because of the delay in the platform? Well, we promise we will implement the abolition no later than year 2025. We will strive to complete the platform by that. If there are difficulties, we will come up with contingency plans. Maybe not as efficient, but the backup plan will take us through the initial 1 or 2 years after the transition. So no matter how the situation change, we promise we will implement the abolition by year 2025, subject to the passage of the bill by the LegCo. And Ms. Kong was right. The change involves some 300,000 employers and some 3 million employees. That's why the Labor Department has formulated a comprehensive plan to make it smooth. You have to do publication and publicity for at least 2 years. We'll prepare information packages. We have to provide calculating tools or calculators or e-calculators for employers or employees to calculate the sum. It takes time. There are so many employers and employees involved. We need to allow for sufficient time for Q&A. When everything is ready, when everyone understands the plan, well, according to our experience, it may take as long as 2 years. So subject to the passage of the bill, before the smooth operation of the plan, we need to allow for sufficient time. Thank you. Mr. Kingsley Wong and then Mr. Emmett Wong. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. Now, we have been talking about how to improve retirement protection for 30 years, and we have been talking about plugging the MPF's loophole for 2 decades. Now, 2 terms of the government have worked on this plan. In the process, enough consultation and adjustments were made. The government really broke out of its mindset and spent tens of billions of dollars to improve labor's rights. So I have three questions for the Commissioner. Now, under the MPF system, compared with our neighbors, is our standard higher or lower? And also for the burden or the liability of the employer compared with our neighbors, is the liability more stringent? This should be the final plan because it is the optimized plan, having consulted all the parties. So is there no room for adjustment? Can we continue? Because if we allow the discussion to go on forever, then we may never have the fruit. Now, it took a long time to convince everyone and adjust the plan. And we know that businessmen are very smart and they are very, very good at calculation. So in the process of communication, what difficulties have we encountered? So we don't want the scenario where everyone agrees with the plan in principle, but objects to the operational details.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your question, Mr. Wong. Well, if you look at the indicators set out by different international organizations, you would see that Hong Kong still has a very advantageous business environment. It's very difficult for us to compare Hong Kong with our neighboring countries in terms of retirement schemes. If you look at the international indicators, Hong Kong still ranks amongst the top. Of course, we can't make a direct comparison, but we believe that the changes made this time would not be adversely impacting our financial environment and competitiveness. Thank you, Mr. Wong, for your reminder. Secondly, we believe that this proposal is the ultimate proposal. We have made many changes. I'm sure you may remember that initially we had different calculations in the calculation of SP and LSP, but after many discussions, we believe to have struck a balance this time. Employers, employees both find it acceptable. I can't say that everyone is satisfied. I've only joined the department for a short period of time, but when I talked to the SMEs, they had questions on the actual implementation. Many people were not familiar with the subsidy scheme, and we made many changes. And in the first 9 years, we would have a cap. So employers do not need to worry about how much they need to pay, because the government has undertaken to make up for shortfall. Well, we have heard other views and positions. We understand that there may be some dissatisfaction, but then in the actual operation, we tried our best to change it for the better so that the business sector would find it easier to transition into the new scheme. Thank you. Well, the last speaking in the first round is Mr. Edmund Wong. I see that a few of you have raised their hands to speak for a second round. Let me read down. Second round, Mr. Shiu Ka-fai, Mr. Tan Ka-piu, and Mr. Lee Chen-kung. If members would like to speak, please raise your hand. Or because there are still many speakers who would like, many members who would like to speak, I would like to extend the meeting by 15 minutes to 12:45. All right, Mr. Edmund Wong. Thank you. I see in a submission that there is actually an objection that some employees would much rather be dismissed, especially in high turnover positions such as the catering business, that the employees might, because of the severance pay, make an excuse to be dismissed. Well, of course, this might happen, but we should look at both sides of the coin, because the employers can also do the same. To make employees sign a 2-year contract and then to hire new people after 2 years, so that employees would never be able to get long service pay. I want to ask the commissioner whether you have planned for this situation. and whether you would see much more of this happening in the catering business with a higher turnover rate. Mr. Holden Chow asked about the designated savings account, and that 1% would need to be contributed per month with a cap of 15%. Let's say wage payout for this way company is about 10 million. So the employee pay 1%, and then in around 10 years, then you'll be able to reach the ceiling of 1.5 million. It's actually an asset for the company before it has been claimed. Would the administration provide a higher return for the employers so that the employers would reach the 15% contribution as soon as possible, and to ensure that the assets could bring a higher return, because 15% after 10 years and 15% after 25 years would be much different in terms of consumer power. The calculation for the cutoff and the government subsidy would also differ. So I agree that we should roll this out when the MPF platform is in place, because it could actually minimize operational costs. So that's my view, and I hope that the administration will also address my questions. Thank you. Commissioner, thank you. Thank you. Well, some would ask whether some employees would deliberately do something to get dismissed, or employers would make inappropriate dismissals. Well, when an employee conducts in an inappropriate manner, the employer could dismiss the employee without severance pay. So there's also a risk for the employee. On the reverse, for employers who want to evade from paying out the severance pay, you would still need to approach the Labor Department or the Labor Tribunal for unreasonable dismissal, and an employee who was unreasonably dismissed would able to get back long service payment even if he has not yet reached 5 years. So this legislation has also been in place since the 80s or the 90s. There might be disputes on whether the employees are eligible for SP or LSP. We have envisioned more work from the Labor and Welfare Bureau in working out the disputes. It would be a bit more complicated in the future, but you have all put it in our plans, and we understand that, so there would be lots more supporting measures. Secondly, even though we're going a step further and to talk about the designated savings account scheme, we would still ensure that the money accumulated in the scheme would bring a higher return. We are looking into that to try to bring a higher return. We understand that the money put in the scheme can only be used to pay SP and LSP. Therefore, we would consider that carefully. Third question on the eMPF platform. This is a very complicated issue, and we will try to minimize the cost. I have a follow-up question. I agree that it would make more work for the Labor Department, but if the employee cannot get SP or LSP and is under Section 9 bracket 5, employees could go for mediation under the Labor Department. And so there would be a lot more work for the department. And I also like to thank the commissioner for considering the 15% asset. We have to try to ensure that this 15% would not be saved in vain. Thank you. Mr. Wong, you need to ask a second round if you have further questions. We now move on to the second round. Mr. Tang Ka-Piu. I wanted to ask about deliberate dismissal, but I want to, since Mr. Edmund Wong has asked a question, I will follow up. Let's say employees used to be very friendly toward customers, but now they want to switch to another company and to get their SP or LSP before leaving. And so they became very unfriendly to customers. So would that actually be a reasonable excuse to dismiss the employee for not being friendly to customers? Well, I can't really answer these hypothetical questions. However, I understand that employers would have concerns. To be fair, the employer and employee relationships in Hong Kong are actually quite good. For employees who want to get their LSP, employees would have already worked for the same employer for 5 years, and they would not easily change jobs. We don't want to use extreme circumstances. The majority of our employers are good employers. So are our employees. But for extreme cases, then the employers can make an instant dismissal. I cannot give you any firm answer right now, because when there is a case and you can bring it to the Labor Department or bring it to the Labor Tribunal. We do not tolerate extreme behavior. But then for an employee who has worked already for 5 years, then by continuing to work for the employer, you need to work for 25 years to receive the cap of 390,000. Well, I hope that this can answer your question. Thank you. Well, you have all heard the answer from the commissioner. This is only a very simple example that an employee used to be all smiley and friendly to customers, but now just because he wants to be dismissed, he became very unfriendly to customers. So I, being the employer, should I dismiss that employee or no? So this is a very simple example on service. Well, you don't have guidelines to your employees on whether this is acceptable. Well, the relationship between employers and employees are good at this moment because they did not have any means of going for deliberate dismissal. Some employees would do that. I've already mentioned it in the last meeting. Now I have to waste time to explain it once again. You have to understand that at this current moment, employers are contributing 5% and employees are also contributing 5%. Let's say the employee wants to leave this job. Currently, there is just no incentive to dismiss the employee, but then with the designated savings account scheme, with 5% from both the employers and employees, and the employees will be able to get SP or LSP without a dismissal, then the employee will not be able to receive this money. And that person, of course, if after 5 years of continuous employment, the same employer would be able to receive the LSP. But then if the employee does not want to wait till the retirement age of 65 and he wants to be dismissed, well, this can happen, Commissioner. This will for sure happen.
Chair, is my time's up? I haven't asked my question yet. Do I have another round? Yes, please wait for the next round. Mr. Tang Biu, Mr. Biu Tang, the Deputy Chairman. Now, the scenarios are mentioned by the members. I also have a scenario for the Commissioner. So please allow me to put the scenario to the Commissioner. There are lots of employers complaining it is so difficult to retain the employees. They keep switching jobs and they can't have a long-term team staying with them. So you are only entitled to a long service payment, LSP, after in employment for 5 years. So if your team is loyal and committed to the job, you would want them to stay 5 years or even 10 years. Now, previously, some are claiming that after the abolition of the offsetting arrangement, it would make the employment relationship casual, and employees can leave whenever they want because they are not entitled to the LSP anyway. So with the offsetting arrangements abolished, we would create a more stable and long-term relationship. Now, if someone gets dismissed deliberately, if they want to be entitled to a LSP in the new company, they will have to work another 5 years and then get themselves deliberately dismissed. Or would they rather work longer and get the LSP? Would that not make the employer-employee relationship even more stable? Thank you for your question. Yes, the design of the bill is that after the abolition of the offsetting arrangements, if the employee works beyond 5 years, then they would be entitled to the LSP. Then there would be more inducements for longer employment. It will benefit the employees more. But it is difficult to say for sure the effects. Or maybe there are other jobs with a much better pay, then maybe they would be willing to sacrifice the LSP. But I don't think we have to be overly worried. We have experience. In the 80s and 90s, we had LSP and SP already. There was no MPF and no offsetting arrangement in place. So back then, was the employment relationship very bad? Actually, it was quite good. I admit, though, the money is there. You are just taking the money under another name. In the future, there may be a contesting point. The employer may say that you are not entitled to LSP, but the employee claims otherwise. Then the Labor Department has to mediate. So we are prepared for that. We have experience. Before the MPF system was in place in the 90s and 80s, we had such experience. So there will be a change, and we are worried about the change, but the shockwave should not be excessive. There are a lot of other factors to consider. For example, the aptitude of the employees and so on. In any event, the protection offered to employees will be improved. Thank you. That's all. Thank you. Next, Mr. Lee Chen-Kung. Chairman, am I coming through? Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Allow me to put my question directly to the Commissioner about the cost. The Commissioner said that there would be a change in terms of operating costs, but you can't give us an exact figure because there will be a lot of changes in terms of raw materials and rent. Well, if subject to things remain unchanged, how will it affect the revenue for SMEs each year? What's the impact on them? I think you have the figure. And for catering and retail businesses, they hire a lot of employees with a wage of with a monthly wage of some $10,000 to $2,000. So what will be the impact? Well, the money has to come from somewhere. You have to tell the public with the abolition implemented in terms of consumers' costs, transportation costs, or even the cost to have a Chinese Chinese dim sum. What will be the extra cost on consumers? Well, actually, the impacts will not be huge. After the meeting, I will work with the government's economists to provide you with a more detailed analysis. Please understand, however, labor cost is just a part of the business cost. There are also raw materials and rents and other costs. And not every employee is entitled to LSP or SP. They are only entitled to these payments subject to fulfilling some conditions under the employment ordinance. So I can't tell you exactly how much additional costs will be incurred after the change. So similarly, when we set the minimum wage, there were even more worries back then. Well, the minimum wage has been implemented for more than 10 years, and everything find themselves able to cope. The change we are talking about now, the abolition of the offsetting arrangement, compared with the minimum wage system 10 years ago, the scale is much smaller. Back then, we were able to cope. Everything still ran smoothly. So we think the impact this time will be much smaller. So we can't quantify it in terms of the additional cost in terms of drinking a cup of tea and so on. But I will work with the government economists to work out a sum. We have calculated it, and the impact is limited. I want to have these figures in terms of rental costs as well as the increase in raw materials, and these are all quantifiable. Same goes for the minimum wage mechanism. Now it is stable. However, you are still reviewing it every 2 years. So for the two caps you are talking about today, maybe they will be subject to a review in the future. Now, after the minimum wage was implemented, it cost us even a breakfast cost us more dearly. So I'm not talking about that. I just want to know how much will be transferred onto the consumers. So, like the commissioner said, please provide us with some figures in a written form after working it out with the economist. Now we still have Mr. Peter Hsu. So I would like to draw a line. After Mr. Peter Hsu's questions, a line will be drawn, and then we will adjourn the meeting after some housekeeping matters. Thank you, Chair. Now, let me give you an exact amount. Now, let's say 2 employees. Both of them have a wage of $22,500. That's the figure you have been telling us. Now, they have worked for 10 years, so 2/3, they should be entitled to $150,000. for employment after 2 years. Let's say Mr. Wong and Ms. Chan, they are working in the restaurants. They want to change the job. They find the other restaurants with better prospects. So they are switching jobs. So Mr. Wong is not getting himself dismissed. So under the plan, the employer does not have to pay $150,000 to Mr. Wong. Well, if Ms. Chan gets herself deliberately dismissed, she will be entitled to the $150,000, and then she can change the job. Is that true? Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mrs. Xiu. That's a hypothetical question, and I understand that there may be such a scenario. If you have a monthly wage of $22,500 after 10 years of employment, if you are dismissed, you will be entitled to the OSP. Now, Commissioner, for the scenario I mentioned, if it is not a dismissal, the employee resign on himself, he will not be entitled to the $150,000. Is that right? He will not be entitled to the OSP. I'm not saying about the. I'm not talking about the amount of the sum. Under the employment ordinance, after 5 years of employment, if you are SAG, you will be entitled to the payment. Now that's the example I'm giving you, Mr. Wong and Ms. Chan. If one of them gets dismissed, she will get the $150,000, and then she can switch to the other job. For Mr. Wong, who resigned on his own, he will not be entitled to the sum, and then the clock will start again in the new job. Now, another scenario for you. Both $22,500 for wage. Now, after 26 years of employment, the employee will be entitled to the maximum of $390,000. The sum is simple. $22,500 for wage, so $15,000 per year. So in 26 years, the amount will exceed the cap, $390,000. If the employee has been employed for 26 years, if he stays in the job, after working 40 years, he will still be entitled to $390,000 only. According to you, after 26 years of employment, he gets himself dismissed, he switched jobs, he gets the $390,000, and then starting from age 46, for after 26 years later, when he retires, he will get another $390,000. Is that true? Thank you, Mr. Xiu. Now, if he gets himself dismissed, he may not be entitled to the $390,000. Commissioner, my question is simple. Now, if he performs so poorly, he can get summarily dismissed. So I can't comment on your scenario. Well, the scenario is, Commissioner, the employees are very friendly in our sector. Now, they come back and they are very unfriendly. Now, should I put up with him? Now, usually they would follow my order. Now, they don't follow my order. So, do you know you will destroy the brand of our service sector? Previously, like you said, the employment relationship was good. After this arrangement is put into place, you will create conflicts between employers and employees. That's very bad, Commissioner. Can I reply? Mrs. Xiu, I think you have made a point, Commissioner. Now allow me to put it this way. I think this is not the full picture. Like I said, back in the 80s and 90s, Hong Kong had the reputation of a shopping paradise. And back then, we didn't have the offsetting arrangements. The scenario mentioned by Mr. Peter Xiu was applicable to the 80s, 90s as well. The employment relationship was not so bad back then. I admit there there are extreme scenarios or extreme cases, but they are not very common. We have the experience back in the 90s and 80s. We didn't have such a problem. So after abolishing the offsetting arrangements, we're just returning to the situation back in the 80s, 90s. Of course, the employers have to make mandatory contributions, but the contesting arenas, like SP and SP, is the same.
Please hold. It's already 12:45. I hope if you all agree to further extend it by 15 minutes because I want to handle with some other matters. Chairman, wait. Or do you all agree? I do not agree, Chairman. I do not agree. Chairman. I just want to handle your issue. Otherwise, we cannot answer your question. I just want to have your question answered. Chairman, I just want to explain to the commissioner. He always keeps on talking about the 80s and the 90s. There were no problems at that time because in the 80s and 90s, it was when the economy was on the rise, and therefore you would see a huge increase in wages, and at that time people were willing to stay in the same company. However, in Hong Kong, you all know the percentage of wage increase in the 80s and 90s. We only enjoyed 10 to 20 years of wage increase, and at that time in the 80s or 90s, if you have to pay severance pay or long service payment, you only talk about 20 years. It was only a very short history. You're not paying like 30 years of LSP. I'm sure if at that moment you need to pay many years of LSP, there would be many problems. It wouldn't only surface now. It is because of MPF that the employer has already made contributions. So why would there be an incentive for the employer to dismiss the employee? And same with the employee. The employer has already contributed, and therefore there is no need to actually look for deliberate dismissal. Well, Commissioner, you've only been here for 1 year. You really don't know what's the crux of the matter. Not sure whether Dr. Law Chi Kong would also stay after his last 3 months of the term. I'm not sure whether you would make a pledge or commitment right now and then totally deny it when there's a change in government. Please do not do that. Please do not think that with the election amendment made that you would be able to just change your minds all the time. All right, we have put this on record. But to put it on the record, do you allow me to extend the meeting by 15 minutes? Chairman. Well, I have to go handle pandemic matters at 12:30, but you know, we are putting the pandemic as a priority. I really don't understand why you're holding this meeting so late, you know, at this time. But you know, this is a crucial matter of anti-pandemic work. I do not agree to an extension of the meeting. Well, you keep on like saying you agree because you wanted to speak, and then now you're saying that you object to the extension of the meeting. I'm not trying to just end it abruptly. I just need time to just handle with other matters. Well, let me just move on to the next meeting daytime. Well, all right, you're the chairman. Well, I agree. Commissioner, do you want to respond briefly? Oh yeah, please give me an explanation, and then I would move on to the next meeting date. We can actually continue the next time, Commissioner. Thank you, Chairman. I understand. I understand the concerns from the business sector. Well, we should not be hindered by extreme circumstances. We need to go back to the reason why we came up with this proposal. With the abolition of the offsetting arrangement, we understand that there would be more conflicts between both sides. We agree that there would be more, and yes, we're willing to work a bit harder to resolve the issues. But would that bring a major change to the situation? It wouldn't. I understand your concern. I just want us to think carefully before we make any changes. Yeah, I know where Mr. Shiu is coming from. I understand the concerns of the business sector. I just want to point out that we did put this under consideration, and we understand there would be more conflicts on the LSP and the SP, but we will just work harder on this end. Thank you. All right, we will stop our discussion here today. Members, will there still be other questions at the next meeting? Mr. Shiu, would you have further questions? Well, yes, I have plenty of questions. All right, I understand. All right, we can continue the next time. And now we move on to AOB. Please mark it on your calendars that the date of meeting will be the 29th of March, Tuesday, from 2:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. So please mark it on your calendar. Well, I didn't set the meeting time for today. After the House meeting last time, before we chose the chairman, the meeting date was already set. So I just want to respond to Mr. Shiu that I didn't deliberately add a new meeting before March 29th. Any AOB? If not, the meeting is now closed. See you next time.